of disturbance of this gland, we have the tendency perhaps to obesity, or perhaps again to extreme thinness and loss of bodily quality and sufficiency. The gland, when it goes on one of these so-called rampages, produces a distinct physical condition. Now, it is also noted that wherever this gland with its physical problem becomes acute, we seem to have an increase in psychic sensitivity. Nearly all psychics have been inclined to be heavy. They have been inclined to indicate that a certain type of sensitivity is to be associated with at least a minor imbalance of this gland. And that where the individual is hale and hearty, and the gland is working perfectly, he does not seem to be as much subject to imagination, to violent internal experiences, to a kind of unworldliness of attitude, as we find in a great many persons who have a heavier physical structure indicating a different pattern of gland function. Also, the effect of sugar on this gland will have to be further examined, because it does tie up in some way with the pancreas. And it's quite possible that the pancreas represents the lower pole of this gland. The function of the various glands through the body are not too difficult. Most persons have had some fair knowledge of them. The principal endocrine glands, of course, are, in addition to what we have mentioned, the thyroid, the thymus, the suprarenal cortex, which is really a double structure, resting in the form of a gland on the cap of each kidney, and the liver, which is the largest gland in the human body, and the pancreas, which is part, of course, in connection with the spleen structure in its function. These various glands have a controlling or regulating action of one kind or another. Let's try and see if we can investigate them just a little more specially. Suppose for a moment we attempt to study the spleen, which is a very interesting gland. And in order to study the spleen, we make a very simple experiment. Let us take a small sheet of very thin rubber, say the size of a sheet of typing paper. And with adhesive tape, we bind this over the area of the spleen, covering the skin over the area of the spleen. If we do this, it will not be very long before we will notice some results. The reason we notice the result is that this rubber protective, which we have placed here, is cutting off certain energy rays. The spleen is like a kind of umbrella. It is almost like one of these radar devices by means of which we can pick up planes at a distance. The main difference being, of course, that the spleen is primarily concerned with picking up energy, not picking up planes. It is a receiving area into which energy flows. And this energy, reaching the spleen, begins to nourish or support the etheric magnetic field of the physical body. Thus, the spleen is associated with the energy by means of which the vital health of structure is maintained. Wherever there is debility of vital energy, something is wrong in connection with the function of the spleen. But There's no use going and trying to have this diagnosed. Almost anything else will be substituted in the diagnosis. The main fact is that unless the physician follows the Paracelsian corpus and becomes aware that the spleen becomes the gatherer of the energy which becomes the vital principle, that that part of man which corresponds to the plant kingdom is sustained by the spleen. Now, the plant kingdom has the power of growth, but not the power of motion. It has the power of color, but it does not possess certain other faculties and powers, and the structure of it is quite different from that of the animal, for example. It represents a less complicated organism with less available function, but it does possess the two basic functions, namely growth and reproduction. Therefore, we must express through the spleen the basic energies necessary for growth and reproduction, and also for color distribution, which the plant has likewise achieved. If, then, we want to know how man as a healthy plant is proceeding, we have to realize that the growth, energization, representing the plant system comes in this area. I also very strongly suspect that this is the tie between man and what we call cycles of climate, weather, and temperature. That in this we have perhaps the field in which the actual relationship between sidereal bodies and man is set up. For here it is that the energies and the energy field of the earth continuously being modified by the positions of sidereal bodies, that this energy field enters man. Here also we have a sympathetic situation. For here we have what I believe it was our old friend Sir Kemlin Digby back in the good old days who said that sympathy belonged to this area, that the sympathies between things are carried in energy. Therefore, that compatible energies create vital sympathies. And by vital sympathies, we mean the affinities of things for each other, or the power by means of which like and like mingle. Perhaps under the heading, therefore, of sympathy, if we wanted a good example of it, we might point out the problem of blood transfusion or infusion. Slightly different in process, but not entirely different in meaning. The infusion would be closer, however, to the splenic factor. But here we have a strange blood introduced into a system. This blood must be overcome by the blood of the person, and its own vital field must be permeated by the vital field of the person receiving the blood. There must be an electric, vital, magnetic victory of the person over the strange blood which he has received. To a smaller degree, there must be also this victory of the individual over every element of food that he takes in, because he is taking in a dissimilar, which he must make similar, or he can do nothing with it. This similarity factor, this sympathy, appears to be largely under the control of the spleen. If, therefore, this becomes damaged beyond a certain degree, the individual cannot live. This is one of the indispensable parts of man. It cannot be sacrificed. In fact, for the most part, the glands cannot be totally sacrificed. There are one or two that can be, because when that occurs, if it is necessary to remove them, their burden is carried to another gland of somewhat compatible purpose. As, for example, the transference of the responsibility, mutual transference between thyroid and parathyroid. Each one can take something that is necessary if needed, and the glandular system, if deprived of a function, redistributes that function over the surviving glands, if it is possible to do so. Some, however, this cannot be done with, and anything happens to these glands, there is no answer. If the a kidney is removed, the suprarenal is generally left, because it is not possible to spare some of these glandular structures. They are too subtle. Yet we are not aware of why they are so necessary. Now, the liver is the largest gland in the body and is also probably one of the most abused. We recognize in the liver, in the apex of the great body of the liver, the great lobe, the center of, well, for our purposes, let's be rather blasé and say the center of the beast in us. This is the center of animal life. As the spleen supplies that which is necessary for the continuance of a plant, so the liver provides the extra things that are necessary for the survival of an animal. Without the liver, man as an animal can't make it. Therefore, the liver has to do with the warm blood factor by which an animal is distinguished. The liver, furthermore, has to do with motion. It has to do with motion and emotion. And the entire possibility of man as a warm-blooded creature, developing a whole pattern of emotional reactions to motion. The relationship of the entire sensory structure to the blood circulation. In other words, an animal has senses, the same as man. They are not bound by the same coordinator, but the sensory perceptions are there. The animal can see, it can hear, it can feel, it can taste, and it can smell. Particularly in the sense of smell, the animal has tremendous superiority. This superiority can only mean one thing, that in the animal, the pituitary and the liver have formed a companionship far greater than in the case of man. In man, the power of the pituitary has gradually been shifted to the pineal. And as a result of that, in many levels of function, man is less self-sustaining than an animal. Perhaps even lacking certain judgment that an animal possesses in a rudimentary way. Certainly an animal can determine friendship and false friendship more quickly than man. It can also find its way home when man is totally lost. The animal does possess certain powers. And the highest power of the animal, seemingly, has to do with its psychic propensity, which goes back to the pituitary body. But we have man as an animal operating through a combination of glands in which the liver and the pituitary constitute dominant factors. Now, where do we find, for example, the mineral content? Man is also a mineral. Man is bone. He is substance. He is matter. He's worth about $8.50 now as pure mineral content. He used to be worth only $1.25, but minerals have gone up since those days. Also, we've discovered a couple of new elements in man that are quite expensive. So his value as merely a chemical compound is rapidly rising. Perhaps he will be ultimately a good investment. Who knows? But the mineral part of man comes back again not so much to the endocrine system as we know it, but to a degree it gives us a clue to this particular structure. Actually, the mineral part of man is linked directly to the life part. Actually, what is a mineral? A mineral is apparently a mass, a substance. That it has certain energy waves of some kind moving in it is pretty well established because of the crystallization forms which we find in the mineral. The mineral is crystallized around energy. But the mineral does not move, it does not grow, it does not reproduce as we know it, and it has only a kind of survival with the exception of certain minerals. There are links between minerals and plants in the same way that there are links everywhere in nature. But the mineral is an existing thing. It is alive, but it is not living as we know it. And this, according to the old authorities, was due to the fact that the human heart has two complete structures involved in it. An internal structure in which life is seated, and an exterior field surrounding that structure, which is the basis of the form principle. That matter is therefore held in cognizable form from the outer magnetic field of the heart. Therefore, actually, matter is not included upon in the glandulous group, even as the ancients pointed out long ago that the physical body is not a principle. The physical body is a receptacle only. It is not a principle. Upon this receptacle, 7 principles operate. But it is the 8th sphere, or the sphere of their activity. Matter, therefore, is a kind of 8th principle, directly related to life itself. The vibratory polarity of life and matter is in perfect harmony. And for that reason, the physical body is tied as a living thing to the structure of the core of the heart, and as a condition or an enduring form to the outer part of the heart. The heart contains or controls both of these processes. We do, however, have certain other, what you might call, luxury processes taking place in man. One of them is represented largely by the thyroid. Now, the thyroid gland, which of course is located in the throat and has a peculiar structure almost wing-like in appearance, has long been associated as a gland which has to do with growth, with bodily equilibrium, with body chemistry, and perhaps generally speaking, it is a sort of pacemaker. The thyroid is a sort of district manager. It is up to the thyroid to accomplish at given times and under given conditions processes which are imposed upon it by other glands. The thyroid is the efficiency expert in the glandular group. It is the power which takes upon itself many different elements and works them into a proper pattern. And if by any chance this pattern process is lost, a series of glandular reactions of several different kinds appear almost immediately. In other words, if this gland gets out of equilibrium, the body, so to say, gets completely out of focus with the patterns of its purpose. Therefore, if there be an archetypal pattern of body function, this pattern is enforced by the thyroid. Now, we might say, is the loss of the thyroid, or part of it, through surgery, therefore a terrible spiritual disaster? No. If man's spirit could have been destroyed by science or surgery, it would have been gone so long ago we wouldn't any of us have any. These are not disasters, they are inconveniences. And it is undoubtedly true that there are occasions when various parts of man must be sacrificed to preserve the rest. This can happen. And as the purpose of man is to experience the growth and development of this world, it is better that he be here to experience than he sacrifice the total experience to preserve some theory about a single part. This would not be considered good, reasonable procedure. Therefore, the thyroid or part of it may be sacrificed. If so, other glands immediately take over to carry this load. And, of course, the load is sometimes partly carried by the liver, partly carried by the parathyroids, which under normal conditions should not have to operate, and partly again by the pituitary. What part of it is taken over by the pineal we do not know, but there is much to suspect that something could be, for the reason that an archetype or a pattern or a coordinator is the primary function of the pineal. Therefore, this may be a relay station in the pineal chain. In fact, in a funny way, all the glands are relay stations of one gland, the pineal. It is the master of them all. The parathyroids are not supposed to have too much activity under normal conditions as the child develops. But we do have now some problem which involves the element of heredity. We have a problem in which the child in a certain early period in life seems to receive and be sustained by a parental energy. Up to a certain time, the child is unable to carry its own energy requirement. And this energy requirement is reservoired in the parathyroids and in the thymus. These glands operate, therefore, under certain stress patterns. And especially the thymus. It is assumed that as the child grows older, that this gland will gradually cease to function. And where it does not cease to function at the time when it should, there seems to be a retarding of the development of the person. Now, this retarding by a hyperthymus condition has been a subject of a great deal of thought and discussion. But again, we have not arrived at any too positive conclusions. The general tendency seems to be to feel that the continuation of this glandular process beyond its time may result in a lingering psychic relationship with parent. In other words, if you have a condition which you might call psychic dominance, or if you have a condition in which two identical twins are constantly psychically aware of the condition of each other, or you find a peculiar psychic sympathy between people so that they seem to know each other's thoughts or emotions, particularly as a result of long association. People sort of growing together, growing like each other, growing so that they almost have one mind between them, or one set of reflexes. It is suspected that this has to do with an unusual lingering of the thymus function, and that this function, therefore, impairs, if it is extended, impairs the assertion of individuality. That the individual never quite comes into possession of himself as he should if this gland lingers in its functioning beyond a reasonable length of time. Usually the activity of this gland is pretty well exhausted by the time the child is 7 years old. But there are cases where it is not exhausted, and we have an involved and complicated psychological situation that can result from this perpetuation. Thus, it becomes obvious that there can be a valid link between glandular function and disposition, temperament. Dis-ease, which we call disease, is really a kind of psychic discomfort. The being is not at ease. This at-easeness will also often reflect the function of the adrenal materials, particularly the adrenaline in the body. The suprarenal cortex, therefore, has been likened to the gland of internal security. There are people who seemingly are undaunted by circumstances. They remain almost continuously sufficient for all of their needs. Needs as people, needs in emergency. These are assumed to possess an exceptionally well-developed and balanced suprarenal process. When the individual is under tension, stress, anxiety, or particularly in danger, or feels themselves to be in a predicament or in a disaster, the tendency is for adrenaline to develop and flow more rapidly. Thus it has been called the courage gland, because it is this flow of adrenaline which gives the individual the sudden power to meet emergency. When this gland operates normally from a reasonably healthy organism, it gives the person that necessary push that takes him through a situation, whatever that situation may be. Nature has provided him with a reserve energy center, by means of which he can meet a stress of unusual intensity. It may, however, be that through continuous emotional stress he exhausts this. If he does, then this energy is no longer available because he has wasted it. It therefore is very important in the life of the individual that he does not permit himself to become overwhelmed by small problems. If he is so overwhelmed, he will have very little energy resource when a major emergency arises. This gland sort of gives the person the push that takes him over the top in whatever his problem may be. It is the same kind of result almost that in old times carters got by beating a horse, whipping a horse. The spurt of energy by means of which the horse was able, under cruelty, perhaps to achieve the end that was desired. But of course the life of the horse was shortened and its health was ultimately destroyed. But this gland provides the whip of energy by means of which a sudden emergency can be met. Nature therefore has provided even for contingencies of this kind. We must sometime recognize that these glands constitute specializations of energy, that they are in a very large measure very much like the chakra situation. In fact, in some groups among some groups of students, the glands and the chakras are very closely related. I do not think this was the original intent, however. I think the glands represent another group of factors. Plato was of the opinion that the entity or the power in man, controlled by means of 8 powers or 8 extensions, and these extensions formed the mysterious symmetrical solid called the octoad, which was the symbol of the soul. The 8 powers of the psychic or of the internal self Now, we have to be a little careful because the word soul does not mean quite the same in Plato as it does in Christianity, for example. By soul, I think Plato probably meant what we call consciousness, because Plato does not use the word consciousness. Therefore, I think to the Greek, this concept of consciousness, or the ensouling power, rather than soul as we think of it psychologically, that this ensouling power manifested through a septenary and one more, the eight. That the septenary represented essentially the glandular system, the eighth representing the outer body of the heart which supplied the physical body, the eighth being the body itself, the lost sphere or the underworld of ancient philosophy which would be corresponding to body. So that the septenary of the glands represent a kind of chord, a musical scale, a group of vibratory rates, which the old Egyptians and Chaldeans tied immediately to the planets, which they regarded as in turn the seven spirits before the throne of consciousness. Thus the glands represent the elaborate chain work by means of which consciousness plays upon the body as upon a musical instrument, causing all of the most subtle variations of its own purposes to be available in body process. This process means not so much merely physical control as the release of consciousness in its various aspects through all of the activities of body. We think of consciousness largely as merely supplying us with certain spiritual volitions, supplying us with certain intellectual intensities by means of which we are inspired to do this or that or something else. But that is only consciousness on one level of expression. Consciousness must be present in the cell. Consciousness must be ever present. Consciousness must be present in process. And by means of this group of glandular structures, the possibility of this direct involvement of consciousness in every aspect of the body appears to be sustained. Now, it was anciently noted also that actually the glands in the body are reflexes of polarities set up in the pineal gland itself. That the gland itself is a sevenfold structure. That the light or magnetic energy which emanates from it is in the form of a spectrum. And that in this spectrum there are the planet-like cores by means of which the gland is tied to each one of the body glands below it. Thus the actual contact is, of course, vibrational. It has to be. But there has to be the vibratory power in that gland in order to create the reflex, as in the tuning harp or tuning fork, in each of the other glands, which is vitalized by reflex. Thus, the energy moving through these glands really represents the motion of consciousness on all of its various levels in the body of man. When we get this entire pattern more or less organized in thinking, we therefore see this consciousness flowing downward through vibratory waves and touching like the rising sun striking the peaks of mountains. First the high points, and these high points in man's function are the glands. Later lighting the whole body. Now man's mental nature, or the mind-brain pattern, forms again a kind of circumference around this, so that we have in the heart the core, which is life, and the circumference, which is body. We have in the brain the core, which is consciousness, and the circumference, which is intellect. Now, intellect is to consciousness the same principle as body is to life. Because here we have body becoming the instrument of life, mind becoming the instrument of consciousness. Life flows into body, consciousness flows into mind. Mind, in turn, by virtue of these relationships, is also capable of a reactional process, by means of which thought, or sensory perception, or experience, or attitude goes back or flows back into the consciousness core. By that I mean only one simple situation, namely that the bridge of the pineal carries traffic in two directions. From the plus direction, consciousness moves across the pineal to take its mental polarity in the mind and its physical polarity in the glandular system. At the same time, the body reflexes and the mental reflexes are carried back into consciousness. And at the dissolution of the body at death, all of these polarities are restored. The pineal gland is the last area of activity to remain alive, and through this vortex, all of the testimonies of the lower centers are carried back into consciousness again. So that it is a two-way road. But behind the glandular system is the real being in the body, operating upon the body, moving through the body, by means of these highly vibratorially poised centers, each of which has an energy rate. These are all this machinery is kept in motion by the vibration of the pineal gland. The moment that ceases, they all stop. But each one has a specialized function to perform, and the coordinated testimony of that function is again returned into the pineal center. Thus, for man, birth or growth, the processes of development, our consciousness moving into body through the glandular system. The process of the severance of man's body at death from consciousness is that the consciousness in every atom and cell gradually unites and flows back again as a consciousness experience into the pineal center, from which it is transferred to consciousness per se, and then the gland has fulfilled its purpose. But man's being a conscious person in this world is largely a matter of the essential functions of these glands, not the superficial function, but the essential function, about which, unfortunately, too little is known, but about which some very valuable thinking can be done on the basis of analogy. And we have enough to support the general picture, even on a scientific level, but we do not yet have all the information necessary to fill in the details. These must come in time, but they're going to be too late for tonight, so we can't do anything more with it at this time. So I think we'll call this the class, and we'll meet you again with another class a little later, but I have an announcement I would like to make, and that is that on March 29th at 8 p.m., our friend Dr. Bode is going to give a talk here, 8 p.m., March 29th, on Indian culture through the ages, and the lecture will be illustrated with films prepared by the government of India, which are on loan to Dr. Bode for this occasion. I believe it's going to be rather unusual, because I think it's going into all of their crafts and cultures, their arts and things of that nature, and their cultural tradition through the ages. It should be a very interesting work, and the films, of course, have been very carefully prepared by the Indian government. So I think you will be interested in it, and we hope that many of you, as can, will be here to be with Dr. Bode on March 29th at 8 p.m. Thank you very much.